devotion. Let it sink back in the ocean.
The covering bombardment began at dawn, the big stuff letting go with a roar. That beach at Vieques was torn and flayed by steel.
To this date, academic theoretical frameworks regarding the classical notions of sovereignty are being challenged by empirical perspectives emerging from different parts across America. Diane Davis and Frank Miller are currently focusing on illiberal forms of hybrid governance arrangements, assuming that sovereignty is not a claim which is exclusively expressed by state actors alone, but rather involves diverse arrangements with non-state actors, suggesting a questioning of the legitimacy of the state's claim to represent citizens' rights. My contribution is adding layers of complexity to the notion of sovereignty by focusing on the socio-political relationship of Puerto Rico and the United States. The relationship of Puerto Rico and the United States was sealed by the Foraker Act in 1900s in order to establish a civilian government in Puerto Rico. 1 year after, the court case Downs v. Bidwell exposed how the United States Congress had plenary power over the island of Puerto Rico, and as such, it could choose if and when to extend the provisions of the Constitution to Puerto Rico. It was in that case where the court created the unique designation of unincorporated territory for Puerto Rico, which meant that the island was outside the established legal order and could be maintained as such until Congress chose to change the status. Because the status has never changed, it is worth diving into the concept of territory and what does it mean to be unincorporated. By looking deeper into the etymology of the term territory, we can bring to the surface new understandings of old meanings. The term territory derives from the Latin word territorium, the land around a town. And according to geographer David Delaney, William Colony suggests that the roots of territory may be even more interesting. Terra means land, earth, nourishment, sustenance. It conveys the sense of a sustaining medium, solid, fading off into indefiniteness. But the form of the word suggests that it derives from terrere, meaning to frighten, to terrorize, and territorium is a place from which people are warned. Perhaps these two contending derivations continue to occupy territory today. To occupy a territory is to receive sustenance by the exercise of violence. Territory is land occupied by violence. This excerpt suggests that the very roots of the concept is controversial, because the very act of naming something a territory bears clear markers of disposition. Beware, be warned, this place is dangerous. And because it is dangerous, it lacks any form of civilized organization, unable to govern themselves, and therefore suitable to being occupied. But what does it mean to be an unincorporated territory, and what impact does it have on the development of a place? An incorporated territory refers to a portion of the domain of the U.S. that does not constitute and is not part of any state, but that is considered U.S. property and thus entitled to all the benefits of the Constitution that are not specifically reserved to the states. Whereas a non-incorporated territory refers to a geographic surface ruled by a jurisdictional external authority, which is not admitted to the full rights of a state, and in addition is not entitled to all the rights of the Constitution. This is the first layer of conflicting constitutionalism. Indeed, these legal provisions are formal arrangements, but there have been constant debates about how unjust this framework is. Through such legal provisions, the colony of Puerto Rico has been the site of diverse governance experimentations conveniently carried out by the federal authorities. The same year the Foraker Act was enacted, the U.S. Navy made it to the shores of Borinquen. Examples of those experiments are the islands of Vieques and Culebra. In search for a location to situate a naval training range base during the 1940s, the U.S. Navy expropriated vast lands in Vieques and Culebra. After intense uprisings against bombing target practice in the 70s and in the 90s, the military operations ended in 2001 with the Navy completely leaving the region in 2003. However, 18 years later, the aftermath of that occupation is still very much present. Which is why I am looking at the role of development patterns of the federal occupation in Vieques and Culebra, because there is an ongoing exertion toward land in a sense of how it is being used, preserved, bought, sold, and exploited through regulations that benefit the more advantaged demographic in order to show, make visible, and link resistance efforts by non-state actors that currently exist against the tensions over land sovereignty, the inefficiency of the state, and its lack of social infrastructure. To further argument the relevance of this study, I am borrowing Bonilla Silva's concept of racialized social system. propose as an alternative framework to explain how the designation of racial groups is never biologically but rather socially based and something that is usually determined by the cultural majority. Bearing in mind that the cultural majority have historically decided the urban constitution of the United States, we see how that can also be a conflict that aligns with Anthony Damiano's arguments that America's urban problems of inequality, crime, housing discrimination, and residential segregation, along with the role of urban planning in addressing these issues, is hindered by insufficient theorization of whiteness. Now, when such violence surpasses the territorial boundaries outside of the US, going overseas to another territory, we could see that perhaps whiteness slowly fades into Americentrism, which is basically the tendency to assume the cultural standards of the United States are more important than other countries. For many years following World War II, the US Navy used the island of Culebra for military practice exercises. In 1970, the islanders began efforts to convince the federal government to cease this practice. The mayor of Culebra at the time, Ramon Feliciano Encarnacion, traveled to Washington, D.C. and convinced the law firm Covington & Burling to represent Culebra's interests. Richard Kopagen assumed this responsibility and pursued legal actions in U.S. federal courts and publicized the ongoing struggle in national newspapers. What he thought would take him 3 months took him years of work pro bono. Wide-ranging efforts brought relative success. Official declarations by the U.S. government terminated all military operations in Culebra as of December 1975. Despite this, military exercises were soon thereafter moved to the nearby island of Vieques, providing a second wave of expropriations of locals to proceed with their military exercises in the 70s. Although the military was kicked out of Vieques in 2003, during the Bush administration, its situation is slightly more complex due to the weapons that were deployed. Ironically, the territory that was owned by the Navy was ceded to the National Fish and Wildlife Research System and simultaneously a toxic Superfund site identified for cleanup by the federal government. Much of the wildlife refuge remains off-limits because of the remaining unexploded ordnance. Signs everywhere are warning visitors not to stray off the permitted path due to the risk of stepping on a bomb. But what are the real risks at the site? According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, there is insufficient information to determine the site-wide human exposure status at the Atlantic Fleet Weapons Training Area. The Vieques Superfund site includes areas of the island that have become contaminated primarily by the United States Department of Defense activities. Extensive amounts of unexploded ordnance have been identified in the range areas of Vieques and in the surrounding waters. Currently, hazardous substances that may be present at the site have not been fully characterized, but may include mercury, lead, copper, magnesium, lithium, perchlorate, TNT, napalm, depleted uranium, PCBs, solvents, and pesticides. Reports in 2019 show only about 1,600 of the 10,000 acres suspected of having munitions have been surface cleared. Reports in 2019 show only about 1,600 of the 10,000 acres suspected of having munitions have been surface cleared. That does not include what remains underground and in the water. Anticipation for the cleanup will take another 10 years on land and 20 years underwater. In land, the Navy is employing a technique called open detonation, essentially detonating old bombs on site, which is another source of contention between locals. However, although they say the method is safe for the public health, locals insist otherwise. Cancer rates among Vieques residents are disproportionately higher than the rest of Puerto Rico. One study made by Puerto Rico's Health Department in 2003 found that residents of Vieques were 27% more likely to have some form of cancer. Getting basic health services is a challenge, as both islands have long lacked adequate health infrastructure, including specialized doctors, which means sick residents are forced to take a ferry to Isla Grande to get treatment. The residents of Isla Nena and Isla Chiquita point to both, the federal government and their local government, for prolonged neglect, describing their islands as colonies of the colony of Puerto Rico. For this reason, many of them feel the need to take the matters in their own hands. In order to understand this ongoing conflict, I spent some time in Isla Chiquita and Isla Nena, and had some chance of having insightful conversations about the risk and resilience efforts in both islands. According to Culebra resident, Lisette Núñez Esterrich, the main conflict that is affecting Culebra is its deprivation and marginalization.
Desde la ocupación militar. Porque cuando viene la ocupación militar, lo primero que hacen es desplazarlos Pero también tienes otras personas que a lo que vienen es a querer apoderarse del territorio porque lo ven como una panacea.
All this parallel with the fact that local residents are being pushed out due to cost-prohibitive market speculations over land. Lizette's concerns are the same of Roberto Morales, who is the Director of Federal Affairs in the municipality of Culebra. Roberto told me that the biggest threat to the permanency of locals to the land is the aggressive real estate market and the gentrification process this brings, to the point that you cannot find a decent place to live under $250,000. This has been unable to control because the Authority for the Conservation and Development for Culebra has never established a cap to regulate the political economy of developments in the island.
Cuando la Marina de Guerra transfiere parte de los terrenos, le transfiere terrenos al Fish and Wildlife. Muchos de los terrenos fueron transferidos a las TEC. Terrenos que están en dominio público en la zona marítima terrestre fueron transferidos a las TEC. Y aunque tú no lo creas, Servicios Generales, que eran los que manejan la propiedad de Estados Unidos, le vendió de vuelta algunas fincas a Culebra. Primero nos invadió, nos las arrebató y después se la vendió al municipio. Todas esas comunidades que tuve ahí con producto de esa transferencia de terreno, producto de una venta, en donde se crearon unos proyectos de urbanización. Pero básicamente se segregaron parcelas, se le entregaron parcelas a los residentes de Culebra y se crearon varios barrios.
Okay.
Se creó el barrio La Romana, la barriada Clark, Villa Muñeco, y la última que se creó, que son las parcelas nuevas, que son las que están ahí arriba, son las últimas entregas de parcelas. Al municipio ya no le quedan parcelas.
Unfortunately, that worked very well until the 90s because people that were gifted parcelas didn't have money to build their houses. And therefore, although they didn't want it to, they were illegally and financially forced to sell their plot of land to speculators who are capable of offering almost $700,000 for a plot of land, which was the most recent case that the municipality recorded in Barrio Fulladosa. According to the director of the Territorial Ordinance, Richard Gautier, hopefully this gets regulated in the upcoming revision to control the massive hoard of land by landowners like Victor González and Denis Riveras, who are the owners of most of the available land in Culebra.
Y tiene que haber un compromiso responsable de parte de los dueños, que porque dicen que son dueños pueden hacer lo que quieran, pero sabemos que no es así y no debe ser así. Debe ser una responsabilidad de parte de ellos.
Regarding the access to the land that is still available in Culebra, resident and president of the non-profit organization Fundación de Culebra, Luz Rivera Cantwell, has some remarks over who's controlling the land.
Sí, ha habido intenciones en más de una ocasión de sacar a los culebrenses de aquí. Y una de las formas es cuando tú estrangulas, ¿verdad?, una economía y unas posibilidades de que las familias puedan estar. Por ejemplo, ¿verdad?, se pasan todos esos terrenos a Fish and Wildlife. Fish and Wildlife declara que tiene la reserva más grande del Caribe en esta isla. Miles de cuerdas. A esas cuerdas, la única forma de entrar es con un machete. De hecho, en un momento, Fundación de Culebra le cuestionó, no solamente eso, le cuestionó que tenía un no pase gigante. Yo le dije, ¡qué atrevimiento! El sitio donde sacan a la población a ese primer poblado y entonces ustedes hacen sus facilidades sabiendo que no es su terreno y después ponen letreros de que nosotros no podemos pasar.
In Vieques happened the same thing, but the conflict over land is a bit more complex than Culebra. The remaining control of the land is divided between approximately 9 entities, and not all of them share the same interest. They are the National Fish and Wildlife Research System, United States Department of Interior, the Municipality of Vieques, Para la Naturaleza, Administración de Terrenos, Department of Economic Commerce of Puerto Rico, Departamento de la Vivienda de Puerto Rico, Corporación para el Desarrollo Económico de Vieques, Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, and Fideicomiso de Conservación e Historia de Vieques, which is a Vieques Land Trust. I met community leader Elda Guadalupe at La Semillera. Part of their focus is to provide opportunity for locals to generate food sovereignty as a resistance mechanism towards the inefficiency of food chain markets in Vieques. But we also talked about the tensions over land.
Pero lo más que quizás me molesta es que cuando un pueblo o un lugar quiere hacer una reserva debe venir de la voluntad del pueblo. no debe ser una reserva impuesta. Así que si nosotros queremos reservar el terreno, debería ser una decisión como pueblo, como comunidad o como mínimo como Puerto Rico. Que diga, ok, vamos a reservar tanto terreno para tener, valga la redundancia, una reserva natural. Y vamos a escoger esta área por esta razón, no esta área porque fue un lugar de guerra y ahora no queremos limpiarla, así que va a ser una reserva. No.
Following on that point, the director of Fideicomiso de Historia y Conservación de Vieques, Lirio Márquez, participated in the negotiations over land returns between the municipality and the Navy, and she was able to explain in a detailed way how that happened.
Porque aquí hay un detalle bien importante, y es que en una isla pequeña, donde la gente está acostumbrada a moverse por todas partes, aun cuando eso era el campo de tiro de la Marina, la gente entraba. Y los muchachos a caballo entraban. Tú no puedes decirle a la gente, no, ya no puedes entrar aquí porque hay bombas. Y la gente lo sabe. Tú no puedes mantener a la gente fuera de lo que es su territorio. No puedes decirle a los pescadores, no vengan aquí, porque cuando la Marina estaba tirando, los pescadores estaban pescando.
From all the things that I learned from her, a few important things stood out. On one hand, the United States forces a contaminator to clean their mess by law. On the other hand, with that same law enforcement, although land in Vieques is extremely scarce, the Congress gave 17,000 acres of land to the fish and wildlife, but even with the promise of cleaning, there was some contentions between locals of how they were managing this situation. Another interesting thing I got from talking to Lirio is that although it's a double-edged sword, the legal framework of the Fish and Wildlife has served Viequenses as a liability against the federal government to request more reparations and demand diligent actions on their part. In other words, it's about using the tools they have, if not against them, the closest to our favor. I also had the honor to talking of one of the rescatistas or rescuers who participated in reclaiming some of the available land with the intentions of having a decent place to build their homes. Unfortunately, although rescatistas are highly respected by the local community, the state doesn't recognize them as such and are cataloged as invaders, asserting their illegal appropriation over private land. As I talked to locals, we were able to unpack some of the core elements that needed urgent attention in order to approach and take action towards competing sovereignties, land control, and expand on particular examples that are generating small but significant efforts to create non-state hybrid forms of sovereignty that are generated by a masterclass of mitigating risks with resistance efforts by local residents. I would like to bring the initial questions I started with at the beginning. How should we address environmental changes, precarity, vulnerability, modern forms of colonialism, and state-produced risk when politics are unstable? How does one move forward addressing risk with a resilient response on major problems in a post-conflict setting? How do we cope with ongoing struggles such as the aftermath of a military occupation? According to Diane Davis, the notion of fragmented sovereignty as a concept allows for an understanding of the ways that citizens may distribute their political allegiances to actors operating at territorial scales, both smaller and larger than nation-states, including through relationship with non-state actors, who may use active oppositions to achieve their aims and seek to control territories in ways that challenge the authority of the state. This situation is built upon the emergence of alternative, competing, and at times overlapping networks of territorial authority at different scales like the ones we just saw. There is no way to think in environmental resilience and sovereignty without harnessing other forms of resilience, which perhaps in this case, the word that we are looking for critically reflecting on multiple forms of risk and alternate perspectives of resilience is resistance.
Why resistance instead of resilience?
Resilience derives from the present participle of the Latin verb resilire, meaning to jump back or to recoil. Resistance means organized opposition to an invader, the latter being a concept that has defined the ongoing struggles of the Puerto Rican community.
Maps are not transparent because history is not transparent. Everything is fabricated. Sovereignty has been thought to be a privilege given by the state. Not anymore. It comes from the people, and although the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, we must challenge those tools that are available to us in order to provoke amendments and take it back.
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 Take it back. Take it back.
Take it
Take
back.
it back.
Tomemos de vuelta.
Take it back.
Take it back.
Take back the land. Take back sovereignty. Take back what is ours through transitional justice processes, organized emancipation, and self-autonomy regardless of the political status of Puerto Rico.
Si por casualidad duermes y sueñas que te acaricia la brisa y sientes que el rocío mañanero besa tiernamente tu mejilla y el aroma del café te hace cosquillas, seguro sueñas que estás en Puerto Rico. Si por casualidad duermes y sueñas que te enamoran las olas y que hay un cielo azul en conjura con la luna para hacerte prisionero. No lo digo porque es la tierra que quiero. Seguro sueñas que estás en Puerto Rico. Yo no puedo ocultar el orgullo que siento de ser puertorriqueño y que mi pensamiento, no importa dónde voy, se fuga hacia la islita, no importa dónde voy, a la tierra bendita, mi pensamiento vuela. Si por casualidad duermo y notas que una lágrima me brota, seguramente es que yo sueño que camino por las calles de mi pueblo y en el ventorrillo aquel de mil recuerdos reviví el ayer, quizás llorando. Yo no puedo ocultar el orgullo que siento de ser puertorriqueño y que mi pensamiento, no importa dónde voy, se fuga hacia la islita, no importa dónde voy, a la tierra bendita, mi pensamiento vuela. Si por casualidad duermo y notas que una lágrima me brota, seguramente es que yo sueño que camino por las calles de mi pueblo y en el ventorrillo aquel de mil recuerdos reviví el ayer, quizás llorando, llorando, llorando.